And speaking of which, I don't know if you see this interview. This guy, it's a Russian guy. I think his name Mikhail Zygar. He interviewed Victoria Nuland. Mikhail Zygar is a Russian dissident, and he did you see that interview with
Yeah,
Victoria
I did
Nuland?
see that interview. I did see that interview. I was quite astonished by it, actually. Though I've also said in my own program, I shouldn't be astonished, not by the kind of things Victoria Nuland says. In fact, I'm surprised at myself that I'm astonished. But nonetheless, I was astonished at how absolutely brazen she was
Mhm.
about the fact that the United States was instrumental in wrecking the agreement that had been reached in Istanbul in 2022. I mean,
Yeah.
it really, I mean, it made my jaw drop, actually. I mean, she's obviously proud of what she did.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And what's fascinating, I find that interview absolutely fascinating because almost like everything she says contradicts somebody or something. For example, from the very beginning, she's trying to make it very clear that she doesn't have much of a Russian roots. Uh, I think that's contradicted what one time Gonzalo Lero's talking about her and
Yeah.
saying, part of the reason she has Victoria Nuland had this hatred towards Russia is because of her Russian roots and believe the pogroms and have hurt her
Mm.
family, etc. So she contradicted him on that. And then the other thing I thought was very interesting is that she's talking about how much U.S. supported Russia once the Soviet collapsed. Well, that's contradict what Jeffrey Sachs said many times. So
Mm.
Jeffrey
Mm.
Sachs, he's the guru of this shock therapy, and he
Mm.
was successful with Poland with this shock therapy. But
Mm.
it was successful because U.S. put in the cash to save Poland from all the
Mm.
inflation, all that coming with the shock therapy. But the US refused, absolutely refused to do that with Russia. Jeffrey Sachs talked about that a lot. And Victor Nuland was saying, oh, we helped Russia and this and that. So she contradicted Jeffrey Sachs on this one.
Mm.
And then the other thing is that she's saying, okay, through IMF and through World Bank that we supported Russia. And even she claimed that World Bank could forgive Russia for the loans. I checked. That's never happened. In
Mm.
fact, both World Bank and IMF made it very clear that they normally don't forgive any loans from any sovereign country. So she contradicted IMF and World Bank. You see, so every point that she's talking about it, like
Yeah.
she's contradicts somebody or some organization or something. I find that's absolutely fascinating.
It is extraordinary, and well, that's again. You're absolutely right. I mean, she makes all these extraordinary, brazen statements, and she's straightforwardly lying. The World Bank, as you rightly say, does not write off loans. It's not constitutionally able to, nor is the IMF, by the way.
Mhm.
I mean, that's a fundamental principle of IMF lending. IMF loans take priority over other loans and cannot be written off. So, in fact, the Russians paid them all back, every single one of them. And of course, when in any argument about what actually happened in the 1990s and whether the Americans were supporting Russia at that time, I always go with Jeffrey Sachs. As you rightly
Mhm.
say, he was there. He was
Yeah.
the point man. He was speaking to everybody. He's discussed this many times. I should just mention one quick point for your viewers that Victoria Nuland is now an academic at Columbia University in New York, where, of course, Jeffrey Sachs is also an academic at Columbia University, as he pointed out to me. So they're colleagues, and it's fairly well known that they intensely dislike each other and have no time for each other. So it'd be very interesting sometimes to see what goes on in the common room when the two meet. But anyway, there it is.
Yeah, and do you think Victoria, I mean, throughout this interview, even though she's smiling, she's soft
Mm.
spoken, but I do
Mm.
get the feeling that she very much hates Russia. I just
She
get that
does.
feeling.
She does. She did. She does. I don't think there's any problem, any doubt about this.
Yeah,
I mean, can I
but
just say? I mean,
mhm,
it's just to go back. The moment the Russians at the end of the 90s told the Americans to go away and started to deal with their problems themselves, that was when things in Russia began to improve. Up to that time, the Americans were there and things were only getting worse. I mean, that's the historical fact. Now, as for Nuland herself, she clearly dislikes Russia.
Mhm.
Why she
Yeah.
dislikes Russia
Well,
to the extent that she does, I mean, it's a bit of a puzzle. But I suspect that in spite of her denials, her roots, which are Jewish roots in Russia, where Jewish people had a bad time, I think it must play a significant role.
yeah, and that's what the Gonzalo Lira was saying. Gonzalo Lira had an
Yeah,
episode just talking about that, and the
yeah,
program that her grandfather, I guess, and grandparents and came to the United States and had hard time here
mm,
to adopt, to adjust to the new life and et cetera, which may, cause lots of pain to the family, for them to reestablish in a new place, new country, and that caused her father's psychological problem, etc. So I think
mm,
there has a lot to do with that. And it's
yes,
probably not just Newland, but some other
no,
Eastern European Russian Jews has some problem with Russia. Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. And and the one thing that this guy, Mikhail, he was mentioning something of he said that he think Putin wants to have some kind of a Yalta kind of a summit to have US and China and sit together to make some kind of arrangement, a little bit like the Yalta conference thing. And Victor Nuland said, "Oh, we cannot do that. Then we cannot just override all the small countries, etc." But what I find that's she totally dismissed this idea. I don't know if that's even true, but the reason she totally dismissed this idea is that she wants the U.S. to control everything, the U.S. to decide everything. Isn't that what it is?
Well, of course it is. I mean, Newland, of all people, talking about the small countries and the concern for small countries, and the United States, suddenly showing all this concern about small countries, even as they're trying to engineer color revolutions in Georgia and
Uh-huh.
all
Yeah,
kinds of other places. I mean,
it's crazy.
as I said, it is utterly brazen at so many levels. But Putin has never proposed any
Something
kind
like
of
that. Uh-huh.
conference in the style that um, Nuland and this man were talking about. I mean,
Right.
there's never been a suggestion that there's some kind of Yalta,
Uh-huh.
sit down being talked about, because it's very important to separate the actual Yalta conference, which took place at the end of the Second World War between Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. And by the way, de Gaulle was also there. And the actual conference and the legend. Because, of course, the legend is what Nuland was talking about in this program, where the Americans and the Russians, or to be more precise, the British and the Russians, cynically divide up Europe, and the Soviets thereby are given free rein to
Mhm.
occupy and conquer all of Eastern Europe. That was not what was discussed at Yalta. That was absolutely not what actually really truly happened at Yalta. One of the things that they agreed at Yalta, for example, was about the setting up of the United Nations. This is
Uh-huh.
something that nobody ever really talks about, but the breakthrough about the creation of the United Nations was happened at Yalta. But as I think we discussed in another program, the main focus of Yalta, when it was clear that the war was going to be won, was what to do about Germany. And the idea was to divide Germany into zones and administer parts of Germany. Each of the various countries would administer their particular part of Germany, all in preparation for the uh, peace conference,
Mhm.
which would agree the peace treaty after the Second World War, which was supposed to come. So all of these provisional arrangements were put in place at that time, but they were never intended to be permanent in the way that Western myth making says, because always the expectation, I mean, not just the, I mean, it was what everybody assumed would happen, that like every other war, there would be an international peace conference. All of the great powers would be present, including, by the way, Germany, where there would be elections in all parts of Germany, democratic elections, to elect a German government. And as at that peace conference, all the countries would participate and would agree a permanent peace. And as we know, that never happened. And it was not because the Soviets didn't want it, it was because the West didn't.
Yeah, the other thing also I noticed that actually, in fact, that the US is, because there's never a permanent solution. So whatever happened afterwards became permanent, right? That Germany has been basically permanently occupied by the US. So,
Yeah.
and the same thing happened with Japan, right? And so, but it does seem like the US is loosening up the control of German to fight Russia. So one of the things that I don't see a lot of reporting, but Chinese media has been discussing, is that there's German fighter jet has been carrying a nuclear bomb under its fuselage. It was spotted over the U.S. So
Yeah.
what happened apparently that they were spotted outside the Edwards military base. And some people just saw them and then took pictures, and they saw them, and so those pictures started floating. And then the German government came out saying, yes, that's true. We are doing some drill, something like that. But those are one-to-one nuclear bombs that they are
Yeah.
practicing. That's very alarming, isn't it?
Oh, it's incredibly alarming. And of course, at a time like this, when there's all these tensions in Europe, um, um, the Russians, I mean, the one thing that is going to alarm Russia more than anything else is Germany acquiring nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And this is
Yes.
almost this is a step in that direction. By the way, it won't be just be the Russians who are alarmed. A lot of other people are going to be alarmed
Yeah.
as well. But here we see it happen. I mean, again, one does wonder whether these people who are doing these things fully understand what it is that they're doing, what memories they are, creating, they're ignoring. Um, the fact that German tanks and armored vehicles have been operating in Kursk region, for example, in Russia, where there was a massive battle between the Red Army and the Nazis. And we've had Ukrainian soldiers dressed in
Yeah.
Second World War Nazi uniforms with Nazi helmets and all of that. And no one in the German government shows any worry or concern about this. No one in the West does. Of course, for every Russian, this reawakens memories of a very alarming time and hardens feelings there that this means that these countries, the Western powers, seek Russia's destruction.
And the more we talk about it, the more I feel like we do need some kind of a peace summit or some kind of discussion to really settle all these things. Because for one thing, Germany should be a sovereign country. Right now, it's not. It's very much
Yeah.
controlled by the US. I actually want to see Germany and Japan, for that matter, to be a normal country. They're not a normal country at this point,
No.
right? And they are within, for example, Japan, the military wing of the country is more or less encouraged by, by the US. And the same thing with within Ukraine, there is also this Nazi faction, neo-Nazi faction within Ukraine that is also encouraged by the US. I feel like we actually do need to have a real discussion and settle all these issues, have some kind of plan to let all these countries become truly independent, sovereign, normal country.
Well,
Don't you think?
absolutely. That absolutely ought to be the ultimate objective of
Yeah.
world foreign policy. I mean, if you, I mean, and I think that if you were to sit down with Wang Yi or
Mhm.
Lavrov and you were to say
Yeah.
that, they would completely agree with you. Unfortunately, and this has to be said, at the moment, the Western powers are absolutely opposed to this because Western policy is block confrontation. They want to create a network of alliances. They want to preserve Western hegemony. Boris Johnson has openly talked about maintaining Western hegemony. So, and of course, that means controlling the two former Axis states, Germany and Japan. And that's what the objective of Western foreign policy has been American foreign policy, and it has been ever since the Second World War.